Awesome. Okay, so kind of building off what we were talking about last week, off of the video that I posted, we are going to be talking a lot about the essentially dealing with fraud schemes and dealing with the identification of the type of frauds that we will eventually be seeing as we go through these sort of definitions. Now, the one of the really interesting things is based on the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the overall types of fraud, they haven't really changed. The methodology that we do see for them has changed. We might see people misappropriating like cash physically before, and then we can see people misappropriating like crypto now. But really, the whole mentality of that concept of asset misappropriation doesn't really change. It's just the way that we go about it changes, and that makes it a little bit easier for us because now we can really look at identifying once you're able to identify the red flags, you're able to categorize a fraud. And if you're able to categorize a fraud, then it makes it significantly easier for you to deal with it, because then you're able to make predictions based on essentially evidence that you see, evidence that you are going to, you can almost predict and really look forward for certain aspects of that fraud scheme that will further be able to identify and help you conclude that this is the type of fraud that you are dealing with, and probably most likely zero in on the individuals that are perpetrating this fraud. So like I said before, based on the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, there are 49 individual fraud schemes that have been classified. Now, the funny thing about that is the number hasn't really changed. What is important about that is that the way you deal with that is significantly different from a methodology standpoint. Now, the internet and other technologies, like we said before, it's opening up a new way of perpetrating these things, but it's not actually creating any new schemes. Because of that, we can sort of take the same investigative methodologies that we had in the past, and we can use them to look at the frauds that we're seeing today. And because of that, because of the similarities between what the frauds and how they existed back in the past and where they are today, a lot of these, maybe the actual platforms, the tools that we're using will be different, but the mindset that we have as we enter the investigation will generally be the same. So we're looking at types of frauds today and different fraud schemes. And so there are three really big fraud schemes that we will be looking at through three like overarching categories. And that will be asset misappropriation, that is financial statement schemes. And then we'll look at finally at corruption. So all of them do share a lot of typologies, and the sort of the borders between each one of them will essentially be different, but there is a lot of commingling there. Essentially the borders, they are very permeable. So you may have multiple different types of frauds working in conjunction with each other in order to bring about a payday for the perpetrator. But of these, we will see that there are the ones that we are talking about. There's also additional ones. We're talking about intellectual property theft. We're talking about insurance and banking fraud. And then we're talking about consumer fraud. Now, consumer fraud is probably the most popular, or one of the top two most popular types of frauds. And we say that because it's generally easy to do. It's primarily conducted from an individual standpoint. And because of that, it makes it much more frequent. Then we'll look at asset misappropriation, which is one, if not the top two with consumer fraud in popularity, because the opportunities that perpetrators do get to commit asset misappropriation is significantly more frequent than any other type of fraud. Now, interesting thing about that is misappropriation is the conditions for you to be able to conduct asset misappropriation is more accessible to to everyone, as opposed to, financial statement fraud or corruption, which require you to be in a trusted position. So asset misappropriation is, we like to call it the everyman's fraud. So scheme categories and characteristics. So each one of the three primary branches of the fraud tree, the ones that we were going to talk about, have unique identifiers that we will look at that will make them distinct from each other category. And being able to understand thoroughly the unique characteristics of the fraud scheme categories will make it really easy for us to identify how we will go about investigating them. Obviously, when we identify the full scheme, we'll be able to pinpoint individuals that have the capacity, have the opportunity to conduct a fraud, and because of that, that limits our suspect pool, makes things much, much easier. So first off, we need to look at who the fraudster would be. Now, in Chapter 2, we talked about the motivational factors of individuals to commit fraud and what characteristics would be generally had by fraudsters. But when we're talking about the fraudsters in Chapter 3, we're talking about who would be most likely to commit the fraud in this circumstance. So we'd be talking about financial statement frauds, asset misappropriation, corruption schemes. Now, when we're talking about individual types of fraud, the only certain people can commit certain types of fraud. Now, eventually everyone can commit any type of fraud if they work hard and they just really dream. But in the moment, fraudsters, they kind of have a very distinct fraud avenue. They can only do so much with what they've been given. So when we're looking at financial statement frauds, we're really looking at people that are in power, people who have the ability to authorize certain things. We're looking at people that can really get away with having this because they're in a position where no one really questions them. Either that, or they're looking at someone who they have the trust of someone in that position, someone who's willing to rubber stamp all of their actions. Then asset misappropriation, I've said this before, but it's sort of the everyman's fraud. So it's usually an employee, someone considered trustworthy, someone who has a lot of social credit, and someone who is able to access a lot of the resources that they would be misappropriating. Then lastly, we've got corruption schemes, and the fraudsters can really be anyone, but they kind of have to have some sort of access. So a fraudster can be anyone, but there's always at least two parties involved, someone that is doing and someone who is allowing it to be done. Sorry, I'm just going to let someone into the class. So when we're looking at a fraud, one of the things we have to do is we have to identify the components of the fraud. So the first component would be C1, which is who is the fraudster. So by identifying this, we get a little bit closer to identifying what type of fraud is being conducted. Now, the second thing we have to do is we have to look at the size of the fraud. So fraud surveys in 2003, which obviously is very, very dated nowadays, reported that financial statement fraud generally was the most populous and most high volume when it came to frauds that were being conducted. So this is important because they're not very frequent. And it makes sense because when you're in a position of power, you have a lot to lose. You want to do something that you're going to get away with it. It's very planned out. You're going to conduct this fraud in a circumstance where you are not going to get caught. You also have the benefit of having all this power, all this social credit in your organization. We are, of course, talking more about occupational fraud than we are talking about personal fraud. So the macro component, not the micro component. With asset misappropriation, it is significantly less. Now, why is that? Because it's the everyman's fraud. might be working at a cash intensive job where you pinch 50 bucks here, you pinch 50 bucks there, but you're not really getting the millions, as opposed to with financial statement fraud. If you overcharge or you undercharge and someone is getting a significant benefit from that, then that's something that you're essentially going to be billing much higher for than your everyman's fraud. Then with corruption, corruption fraud is kind of, you're in the middle there, because corruption does happen very, very often, depending on which environment you have, depending on which culture you are going to be operating in. You may have a little bit more fraud than you don't. So when a couple of years ago, my parents are Vietnamese, and so we went back for my cousin's wedding, and Vietnam is rife with corruption, and corruption from all different levels. We're talking from the random cops that stop you on the street for, like driving 1 kilometer over the speed limit, all the way up to the president or the chairman of the Communist Party. So the thing with corruption fraud is that it kind of has a really big range. You can deal with fraud from, the basics, or you can deal with fraud from all the way to the top. And so it kind of fits into that middle ground there, where while it is popular, not all of it is high volume. And so we end up seeing that the most high volume crime when it comes to fraud from a purely incident perspective is asset misappropriation, but the fraud that comes in the highest volume from a dollar perspective is financial statement fraud. So why is this important? Why is Calvin telling us about these sort of numbers and these stats? Well, because when you're addressing certain types of fraud, obviously, we have a limited amount of resources as a company, as law enforcement, as compliance, as whatever. So you kind of have to pick your battles. If you are in a company or you own a shop, like this extends both ways. If you are, a franchisee and you own a McDonald's, then dealing with asset misappropriation will probably be much higher on your list and higher priority than dealing with financial statement fraud. Why? Because if you're a franchisee, most likely you will be dealing with the financial statements. No one else will. And if you are stealing from yourself, then, well, you are to blame. If you are a government entity that is in charge of regulatory, if there is an enforcement capacity, then maybe corruption fraud is something you should look at a little bit more. Now, obviously, in a perfect world, we deal with all the fraud, make sure that everyone is, acting as squeaky clean as they should be. But when you are working in a strategic resource type situation, then sometimes you have to deal with fraud as you see it. Sorry. Yes, I think I heard a question, or someone's mic just like turned on for a second. No? Okay. If you do have a question, you can just put it in the chat, or you can just like start talking, and and I will stop, because I can't really see you right now. Everyone has their cameras off, which is cool, totally cool. So that's our C2. That's one of the things that we need to identify when we're trying to identify what type of scheme that we're dealing with, and so what type of investigatory technique that we need to use to be able to assess this sort of fraud. Then we've got C3. Now, certain frauds will deal in different frequencies. Now, if you are doing statement fraud and you are consistently overbilling and then getting a refund from the company, from the vendor company, and you pocket said check, then the frequency is going to be significantly high. Sorry, I think is someone talking? Questions? No? Okay, never mind. Sorry, I got really excited. I'm like, oh, questions, this is great. Then when you're talking about something like corruption has high frequency. Maybe if you're talking about a one-time pump and dump for a type of stock, then you're probably going to end up, you're going to see it less frequently, and that's going to be a way for you to identify who may or may not have been the culprit. Someone who maybe had significant access versus someone who maybe had a one-time access. You can see, based on the frequency of that, you can narrow it down to who may be the perpetrator that you're looking for. Then C4. So what motivates a fraudster? And you'll see in many circumstances, depending on the type of fraud, you'll see very different and distinct motivations. And so with financial statement fraud, generally you're going to be looking at someone who's trying to bring a benefit from some sort of misrepresentation. So psychology does identify a correlation that we have with financial statement fraud and certain egocentric sort of tendencies, certain tendencies to feel like they are more in control, and tendencies that identify someone who generally is more, whether type A or type B, depending on the amount and the frequency of the fraud. Now, a lot of these sort of psychological tendencies that we're identifying in fraudsters, while they are very, very telling, often are affected by a lot of environmental factors. So while I'm telling you that, oh yeah, financial statement fraud is done a lot by egocentric people, there is a significant environmental capacity that really affects whether or not they're going to commit this sort of fraud, or corruption, or asset misrepresentation, or consumer fraud. Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Hi. All right, Kimia. That's a really good question. So an example of financial statement fraud is asset misrepresentation. So we'll talk about this in a later slide, but I'll give you a quick little example now. Is if we say that we have more accounts receivable than we actually do. We say that this company owes us this, and this company owes us this, and this company owes us this, even though we haven't actually made the sale yet. So hypothetically, we have one situation where a police force is purchasing a large number of GMC SUVs. And those SUVs would account for a significant sale. Now, we are still negotiating the sale. So the sale has not been complete. We're not even sure if the sale is going to go through. Excuse me. And we then go and place that on our balance sheet. Now, that violates GAAP, or generally accepted accounting principles. But the real issue happens is when that piece of news ends up affecting our stock price, ends up being used as information that would make our firm look better, whether that is from a loan perspective. If you say, hey, I have all this cash flow that's coming in, specifically, I have this one big contract that's coming in that is really, really big and will make a lot of money. We're building a partnership with this company. All of this is fictitious. We haven't done any of that yet. And yet we're misrepresenting ourselves to say that we are. And because of that, we are essentially using falsities to gain a benefit. And that's one of the key aspects of fraud is you are intentionally using information that you yourself know is fictitious, it's false, or it's partially false, or it is not true enough to be true. And now, if you're a lawyer, or if you have lawyer friends, I'm sure there's many different ways you can spin something, but at the end of the day, it is information that you know is not true, and you're using it to tell someone, to get them to do something to give you a benefit or an advantage that is to your benefit, knowing that they will believe you when you tell them. So if I told you that I am a millionaire, and because I'm a millionaire, I have so much capital, you should lend me like $1,000, which is generally, as you guys know, the the MO for a Nigerian scam. It's like, oh, I am a Nigerian prince. I have $3 bajillion. And with my bajillion dollars, I just want to, send it to you because you seem like a great person. And because of that, I just need $2,000 to pay the bank fees to send that money to you. I'm a bajillionaire. I just don't have the money here to spend. So if you spend your money now, I will like 600,000 times your money in the future.
It's a usual confidence trick, right? It's just
Yeah,
like the Harris or the Air.
something like that. And you see this in all cultures and all languages. It just so happens that the most popular ones via email back in the 90s was the Nigerian prince. And now it's funny because I have a friend who he he met some Nigerian royalty in Nigeria, and he's like, yeah, I don't know why we would do that. We would just let's bring the money over. It's pretty easy. It's really funny. Yes, Glenda, Anna Delvey is a good example of financial statement fraud as well. There's a show on Netflix. It's really good. So to get back on course, C4, we're really talking about motivations. Everyone is going to be motivated differently in many scenarios. And I guess we're really talking about this from one of the ones that I've experienced myself is in Mexico. And as a police officer, you're going into Mexico and then someone is asking for a bribe and you're just like, this is so weird because you're a cop and I'm a cop, and that's not how we do things. But in many situations, it's because of need. In Mexico City, the average salary back in the early 2000s for a police officer was like $1,000, maybe less than $1,000, like $200, $300 a month, and then cross the border into the United States, and their monthly salary was $2,000, $3,000 US. And so you can sort of see the discrepancy, and almost like, I'm not trying to validate corruption, but trying to give a background synopsis on why certain environments kind of cause corruption or breed corruption. And a lot of it is because of poverty. Oh, sorry, Claudia. I saw Glenda and it's all good. It's all good. When it comes to financial statement fraud, a lot of times we'll see that this fraud is related to performance bonus, pressure from stockholders, or an indirect link back to other defining factors for their company health. So they might say that, hey, you know what, John, as a CEO, if you can bring our shareholder dividend above 7%, you know what, we'll give you a bonus. Now, as we remember from chapter 2, maybe there's additional pressures that are out there. Maybe, this CEO's mother-in-law really wants him to buy them an island because all of her friends' sons have islands. And, he can't provide. There is a pressure component to it that motivates fraudsters to commit fraud. Then number 5, we're talking about materiality. So fraud categories are so different in the areas of materiality because a lot of times they will approach the materiality aspect of the fraud differently depending on where they're coming from, depending on the environment. So generally, we will be looking at what they can get away from, what they can get away with, what they have access to, and what is liquid at that exact moment. A lot of times it is a crime of opportunity. Like an example, if you have this amazing bank fraud idea, but you can't access any of the bank systems, or you can't find anyone that's willing to access bank systems for you, then you're kind of screwed. You have this amazing plan, but you can't do anything. So in many circumstances, a fraud occurs based on what is available to them, what is readily accessible. You could see that themselves, maybe they may not have access to something, but maybe they're in charge of something very important that other people might want to have access to. You could be like the warden in a prison. You could be someone who manages the docks. You could be a customs agent. Any of sort of these people may have the opportunity to be bribed, and then corruption will kick in. And so they themselves may not have access to anything that's important, but their position allows them certain responsibilities, certain allowances that they then provide to others, obviously for monetary compensation. Then we're talking about benefactors. So financial statement frauds are perpetrated on behalf of the company, although usually because such frauds benefit the fraudster. In chapter 2, we're looking at fraud that is referred to as frauds to the company. So the good majority of our course here will focus a lot on occupational fraud, just because the course is designed almost to deal with a very compliance-centric direction. So even the law enforcement component of this is almost designed so that law enforcement, when they have to deal with corruption aspects, they will understand sort of like the corporate world, which is good and bad, just because fraud is very interesting, and it doesn't just live in the corporate space. And I feel like we're kind of being pigeonholed here, but that's okay, because we're going to talk about money laundering, which is really fun as well. And so that it'll be fine. But asset misappropriation and corruption benefit the fraudster versus financial statement fraud, which almost benefits the company first and then indirectly benefits the fraudster. So when we're looking at financial statement fraud, we are looking at fraud that affects the company, whether that be liquid cash, inventory, stock prices, loan amounts, expenses. Something has to occur in the company first before it's able to be passed before the benefit can be passed on to the fraudster. So versus cash misappropriation, in which there's a direct link. There's a register, you put your hand in, you pull out $50, the $50 goes in your pocket, and you now have $50. Versus, financial statement fraud. Same with corruption. Corruption is source of funds directly to the receiver of funds. There's no indirect relationship that has to happen between entities for the fraud to occur. And so understanding who benefits first from a fraud and fraudulent activities means that you're able to really zero in on what the motivation is. And once you're able to identify the motivation, you're able to really kind of dig down and see what they're going, what their mindset is, and how the full fraud is constructed, which is something we'll get into later. Hi, Ia. Yes, you had a question.
Yes. Hi, Calvin. This is Ennis. Just a quick question. So, would it be accurate to say that in asset misappropriation and corruption, the benefactors get the benefit directly, whereas in financial statement fraud, the benefactor, the fraudster, benefits through the scheme indirectly?
Yes. That's a really good way to put it, because like I said before, there's a secondary step versus in the other two versions where it's a direct point A to point B benefit value transfer, which makes it significantly easier. Like it's much easier to steal cash from a cash register than to create an intricate fake ghost employee that gets paid, and then that paycheck goes to a PO box that you then go and pick up under the cover of night. Like there's significantly more steps and more chances to be caught when when you're dealing with indirect benefits. So yes, but great question. Right. And then number 7, we're talking about size of company. So because financial statement fraud is usually motivated by stock price or something indirectly related to the fraudster, but directly related to the company, you'll see that obviously it happens in bigger companies, in companies with many intricate systems and a specific sort of infrastructure. Now, why is this important? Because like I'll go back to our franchisee sort of example. If you have a franchise and you are the owner and you also wear many hats, you're the owner, you are the manager, you are the hiring manager, there's not really many systems for you to be able to exploit. And because of that, there's only so many different types of fraud that you can sort of see and you can sort of have access to. So through such companies, the complexity and the difficulties of conducting certain things and the outsourcing or the insourcing or the division of jobs and labor ends up making things much easier to conceal. And because of that, you'll see certain different types of frauds as opposed to others. Oh, sorry, Andrew, everything good? Am I cutting off or is it just lagging? Because if it's just lagging, I'll just turn off my video.
Your screen was frozen and your sound faded out for a period of about a minute prior to just now.
Okay, let me turn off my my video because it was prior to this, so that hasn't happened yet, right?
It just happened for the first time now, just when you started talking about division of labor within companies and that sort of thing. I heard bits and snatches, but then it faded out.
Okay, I will stop my video, and I think that'll make things easier.
Okay, cheers.
Okay, thanks, man. So I'll just go back and talk about, so the size of the company is very important because based on the size of the company, we'll be able to see what sort of frauds are available. With the division of labor and the many systems and infrastructure components in a company, you'll invariably find that it is easier to be able to hide certain things. Source of funds, destination of funds, who handles what, who authorizes what. There's a lot of redundancies and a lot of fraudsters will take advantage of said redundancies. So these companies also tend to be subject to other regulations, which generally lead to more controlled environments and may have a smaller risk associated in some capacities versus in other capacities. While you may not have to deal with asset misappropriation because everything is checked and there are checks and bounds for that, you may, lose out on an extra employee that appears because your company is so big, you don't really have the ability to know everyone in the company. So as we can see, based on a 2019 survey, they were able to correlate the cost of fraud per employee for employees for companies that were above a certain amount. So as you can see, when it came to companies that were lower than 100, we have a significantly higher amount of fraud that happens for the sole reason that a lot of this fraud is coming from things along the lines of asset misappropriation, which can be done more. I think this specifically is talking about asset misappropriation. So as you can see, the larger the company, the less ability for employees to steal. Larceny is significantly more difficult when you have a lot of eyes on you. So now that we've identified the 7 components of what makes up a fraud, once we are able to identify these pieces of evidence, we are going to be able to much easier identify the scheme that is being used and with a little luck, the individuals that are perpetrating said scheme. So now we're going to talk specifically about different fraud schemes themselves. So like these are, generally the mindsets and the strategies behind a lot of these schemes. So financial statement schemes, category of financial statement schemes is broken down into two smaller subcategories. So we have financial and we have non-financial. So non-financial it's very rare to happen. So financial statement schemes and non-financial statement schemes, the benefit that you're extracting from a non-financial financial statement scheme is not monetary. You could use it as a way to get yourself around being fired. You could assess a sort of different market share. Yes, eventually it does kind of work itself back to a monetary capacity, but your goal is not really monetary as much as it is non-financial. So say you got fired, you are a disgruntled employee and you are trying to conduct fraud in a way where you are trying to badmouth or elicit bad branding for your previous company. So it still falls under the same categories of fraud because you are providing information to someone that you know is false, but that you are presenting as truth, and you are getting a benefit from that is you are getting even, you are seeing a reduction in sales, something like that. You'll see a lot of disgruntled employees go out and leak some news to the news media, news that may not exactly be 100% true. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about non-financial financial statement schemes. So it could say that they're planning to fire all their employees. They're moving their factory and everything to China. Now, non-financially, that would cause definitely an impact on the brand and stuff. From a financial sense, if there was any sort of benefit, like say the employee had a whole bunch of company shares, didn't have a whole bunch of company shares and wanted to short the company, then there would be a financial component of it. But the non-financial financial statement scheme, which is kind of a tongue twister to say, is that there would be brand damage, and that would be his benefit. Then corruption schemes. And then obviously financial statement schemes that are financial focus on monetary, but those are the standard ones that most likely we are going to be dealing with. Then we've got corruption schemes, which make up 27.4% of all frauds and can include economic distortion, illegal gratuities, conflicts of interest, bribery. Bribery will fall under three specific categories, which is kickbacks, bid rigging, and actually illegal gratuities also falls under that as well. Lastly, we have asset misappropriation schemes, which involve the misuse of any company asset for personal gain. So by definition, if you steal pens from your company, by definition, that would also be asset misappropriation. If to a certain degree, if you were to use, if you really want to go to the nitty gritty of it, if you use company time, people are paying you and you are applying for new jobs. I mean, obviously there is a limit to what we consider, but they would also fall under various asset misappropriation schemes. So asset misappropriation, on that topic, it is the act of misappropriating or turning to a wrongful purpose assets that belong to a company. The term is also used to embrace the taking and using of another's property for sole purpose of capitalizing unfairly on goodwill and reputation of a property owner. We'll see asset misappropriation most clearly in theft and larceny, and we will identify that the misappropriation of branding is also something that is done as well. In many sort of scenarios in white collar crime, we'll see one company or a smaller company masquerade as a partner of a larger company in order to win a contract. Being that they do not have the credit in their work yet, they will sometimes use that as a way to get a little bit of an advantage versus another firm that, you know, may not have the experience. Maybe they have the same experience, but oh yes, I've worked for KFC, I've worked for Spalding, I've worked for the Toronto Raptors or something like that. It's like, oh, you have experience with Fortune 500 companies, you have dealt with probably more complex situations. Yeah, let's hire you as opposed to someone else. You can misappropriate assets that are non-tangible as well. You could say that you've been trained by someone. You could say that, you know, you have a certain certification, even if you might not exactly have that certification. Now, when we're looking at asset misappropriation, we're looking for very specific red flags. And caveat to this is that red flags are not always distinct, in that many different types of frauds overlap a lot of the red flags that they have. You'll see changes in behavior multiple times across many different categories, because changes in behavior is just a human response to doing something that we know is wrong. So you'll see, you know, if you steal something, changes in behavior. If you, you know, say that you bought the company a whole bunch of muffins or paid for heat and then, you know, didn't actually pay for heat. And then, you know, you pocketed the cash. You're going to have a change of behavior. You're going to feel bad. You're going to feel shame. You know, corruption. You took you took $50 and you let someone into the back of a movie theater. You're going to feel shame. Well, I don't know. I've seen many people do that and feel nothing. So anyways, you're going to see a lot of physical sort of identifiers, but then you're also going to see a lot of non-physical identifiers. So you're going to see an irregular work history. You're going to see, disgruntled employers. You're going to see having financial strains or debt problems, exhibit traits of psychotic issues, constantly complain about the boss or the company, how they treat them. These are all components that would legitimize, rationalize, or motivate an employee. Now, if you remember, and we go back to the fraud triangle that we talked about in chapter 2, we could see stuff like having financial strains. Having financial strains is an issue that may motivate people to conduct fraud. You could say, constantly complaining about how the boss or the company treats them. Well, that is also an issue because they feel as if they are being taken advantage of. They feel as if that they're, not being paid their due. And so they say that they're going to, the fraudster, the fraudster is going to go and exact what is due to them. And a lot of times that ends up being, their pound of flesh, their kindly explain how an employee misrepresenting this qualification amount to financial fraud or asset misappropriation. Hi, so I'm saying based on like a very technical capacity, it is gaining a sort of advantage from something that you do not have. So if you said that you are not, like obviously there is a limit to this. Like if you take a pen from work, by technicality, yes, it is asset misappropriation. Is someone really going to call you out on that? Probably not. But it's about the textbook definition of what it is. If you're borrowing an intangible to say that, hey, I've worked for this company, and that's not true. You've borrowed an asset, whether intangible or not intangible, and you're using that information that you know is false, and you say it to someone who will believe that it is true, and you get an unfair advantage from that, that is considered fraud. And so, again, you could say a lot of things like, I took a pen from work. Is someone going to say something wrong about that? Well, probably not. Everyone pads their resume. But then if we keep going down the line, you could say it also, it depends on your environment as well. You might talk to someone who grew up in a culture where corruption or palm greasing is very normal. and they will have a different perspective on that. Like, oh yeah, if the cop stops you, just give them a $20 bill, and then you're good to go. And when it comes to certain other cultures, we might be like, okay, that is not okay, because small corruption will eventually work its way into big corruption, because you'll see certain companies will get contracts or multi-million, multi-billion-dollar contracts because they bribed a government official. So from a technicality standpoint, and I'm really glad you brought this up, by the way. Yes, Claudia, that it's a good way to put it. Yeah, when you have to respect the small laws if you're going to respect the big laws and stuff. But at the same time, there's also a concept called the spirit of the law. You don't want to be so specific on the wording and the exact lettering of it, and you miss out on the whole reason why we had that law in the first place. And so definitely there's a balancing act. It's like, when do you apply the letter of the law versus when do you apply the spirit of the law? If the law is there to protect people, and by applying the letter of the law, you're actually more negatively impacting people than if you didn't apply the law, then there's an issue with legislation there. There's an issue with, case law, with Code Civil. And so it becomes a per environment issue when you're talking about whether or not something is okay or not, because it is unfortunately, it is cultural, and it is for the greater populace to discuss them legislatively or judicially. So yeah, I'm not gonna I don't think I'm paid enough to say that, like, oh, this is wrong or this is wrong or you should fix this. No, I've only really lived in like 2 countries, so I can't really say what's exactly right or wrong depending on what is considered the norm there. Yes, thank you, Jenica. That was a great question. Thank you. This is great. I love teaching you guys. Anyways, from asset misappropriation, you may see individuals refusing things that generally people might not refuse. And a good example of this is when you see someone who maybe was a head cashier, maybe they were a bank manager or head teller or customer service supervisor, and they are being offered a transfer, they're offered a promotion, and they choose to deny it, to decline it. Now, by itself, that doesn't mean anything. That's someone just like really likes their job, or this position has like the exact right amount of stress. Maybe it lets them like leave early, pick up their kids. There's a whole like myriad of reasons for like not wanting to have a transfer. But at the same time, like it can be indicative of a capacity for fraud. Essentially, it is a red flag. It is a point that you look at and you might be like, oh, that's weird, which essentially is what a red flag is. You're like, that's strange. Doesn't mean anything yet, but I'll keep it in the back of my brain. And then when more of them kind of pile up, they're like, okay, I'm starting to see, a trend. I'm starting to see a pattern here. And then from there, then, that may mean something after we assess and accumulate more data. And the reason why someone may reject that transfer, hypothetically, if they are involved in fraud, is maybe the position they're promoted to is paid more than their position, but maybe that doesn't allow them to take the $50, the $200 that they may have access to. And maybe that extra supplemented income that they get far exceeds the raise that they get from this promotion. And so they're like, okay, well, you know what? I'm not going to do that. Or because they're afraid that if they leave, no one is there to manage the fraud, and that excess evidence that they've left behind, or the things that they do, or these sort of agreements that they have with people are going to be discovered. And so they're afraid that if they leave that position, everything will be discovered. And they're willing to sacrifice that, that promotion, that raise, that additional job offer to keep themselves, from being discovered. So we've talked about this before, but cash schemes involve taking cash from one's employer and are the most popular asset misappropriation scheme. Now, why? Because there's a lot of cash-based businesses and it's pretty easy. So it is generally much more popular than, your financial statement schemes. Cash schemes will talk about fraudulent disbursements, talk about straight up theft or larceny, which is the easiest version of that. And then billing schemes, which talk about the manipulation of costs and expenses as a way to exact a certain amount of money from the transaction. So you might say that, hey, you may have 2 locations for factories. You know that one factory is empty right now or has 1 object, 2 objects, very few objects, and you don't need that much heat to be able to warm that object. Now you have 2, okay, I'll just draw this out for you. Makes it easier than if I just describe it. Okay. So a good way to look at
overbilling, is that?
Yeah, overbilling, yeah. Fraudulent disbursements, you might have you might have returns that don't exist, and you may just take the money, take the sale, and then reimburse the sale, and then code that as we had to give cash out, and then you collect the money. But you might have two factories, and you only have stuff in one factory, and maybe the supervisor is in this factory and you manage this factory. So maybe this stuff is, I don't know, it's like evaporated milk. They still want to refrigerate it, but it's not necessary that they refrigerate it. So you say that you're paying heat for this building, but you don't. You just take the money and you pocket it into your pocket. All the while, you tell your supervisor, you tell the accounting department that the bills have been paid. And so that's why they need to keep giving you the checks or giving you the cash to pay the bills off. So there's always a way for you to deal with that. If you're trying to identify the fraud, you kind of have to look holistically at the situation that the individual is in, and then from there kind of derive a methodology for bringing benefit to themselves. And that ends up being, I thought there was a question. That ends up being a really important aspect of financial investigations. Then you've got the shell company. So a shell company, for people who aren't aware, and I'm sure most of you guys are aware, you've watched Narcos, involves using a fictitious company created for the sole purpose of committing a fraud to generate checks from a company's resources that will then be directed to the culprit to her benefit. So in this situation, same as this whole heating thing, except you say that someone is coming by to inspect the shingles on the factory roof. No one is doing that, but you're making up this company that comes by every 2 weeks to make sure the shingles are okay. And then, you make up a report and you're like, oh yeah, the shingles are good. And then you pay yourself like $600. And so in a shell company, you are essentially creating a fictitious company that gets paid, and then you collect that money for work that is never done. So the fictitious vendor in a shell company must be added to the authorized vendors list. Essentially, you want to be able to make it as easy as possible to pay this company, because the more checks and more time that a non-fraudster interacts with the shell company, the more likely that they will see the falsity of it. So you might have, a one-click, one-tap. You might have it as a part of like your authorized billing, where you only need 1 signature as opposed to 2 signatures. You want to make sure that it's done in a way where there's no paper trail. So you might have to like check it out. You may have it so it's direct transfer. And then so once the transfer is gone, you can see that you can manipulate the transfers from the back end. Generally, it is done in a way where it is informal and there is very little interaction between said shell company and the actual buyer or purchaser of the service, of the fictitious service. And this is because you just want to limit the overall interaction. And you'll see in situations such as this, you'll have fraudsters try to go out of their way to limit the interaction between the shell company and the resource manager as much as possible. They might go out of their way. They might make excuses to do things for you, even though it's out of their way. You're going to see a lot of that sort of activity. So when you're talking about the shell company, you're talking about someone who's in a position of power. You have to have the authority to add a vendor. Oftentimes, you will be the one that approves a phony invoice. That makes things much easier. Or again, you're in a position of trust where an authoritative figure who can approve the phony invoice is willing to rubber stamp your actions. So you might be someone who has a lot of social credit with the manager, like you're their best friend, you are a teacher's pet type of scenario. And they just implicitly trust you. You are in a position of trust for them to just be like, oh yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, you just do the thing and just give it to me and I'll just sign it. And that happens quite often when you are in positions such as that. So sometimes you'll have scheme variations and asset misappropriation when it comes to scheme variations generally don't vary very, very much. So with pass-through schemes, you're essentially inflating invoices, you're overbilling, just like Zach said. I think that was Zach said, and then you're the one that approves them, and so that this ends up allowing you to transfer large amounts of funds outside of the company in high frequency without people seeing, because once you get them used to that amount, you're like, oh yeah, it's a $3,000 monthly cost. It might only be a $500 monthly cost, but people start to get used to that, and then when they see the $3,000 cost point, they're just like, oh, okay, yeah, that's just normal. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. You almost get them to become educated on that component, that in many cases, the scheme is only really identified when the person who manages a resource or the person who does the back checks or the auditors end up going in and seeing and having a conversation with that individual. And they're like, oh yeah, this is just how much it normally costs. And then they take in a research of standard average cost of this service, and they realize that it's so much more absorbent than any other company out there. And they wonder why they've been paying $3,000 when it's only cost $500. Well, we have other versions of asset misappropriation, but that are based on these variation schemes, but they're not really significantly different. Asset misappropriation generally does follow the same sort of methodology and the same sort of mentality, which makes it it's a benefit as an investigator, because you end up seeing a lot of the same sort of red flags, and so it makes it easier to identify when something is straight up a larceny scheme or a scheme that is a slight variation. But when you're talking about AM, you are talking about personal purchase schemes, which are very, very normal, where you take a company credit card and you buy yourself stuff, and they try to legitimize it that this is for the company. Ghost employee schemes, where an employee magically appears and they get paid a salary. Maybe they work nights so no one sees them. False worker compensation, where you pretend to have an issue and company compensation will pay you for that. Disability insurance schemes will fall under this as well, because the company does pay for insurance. And then, falsified wage schemes, where you are putting in more hours than you actually worked. And you are putting in overtime when you actually weren't there. A lot of these sort of schemes kind of fall into the same sort of methodology. So why is that important, though? Because a lot of these sort of red flags that you see in asset misappropriation ends up being very similar to personal micro money laundering. So like money laundering from like a consumer, from a personal standpoint, but also from TBML, which is actually a really big problem because it is a very difficult way to, it's very difficult to identify and investigate, but it's a very effective way of moving illicit funds across borders. So trade-based money laundering takes advantage of the complexity of international trade and the fact that KYC and AML policies and standards will often differ slightly between different nations and different states. Now, most of the countries that we will probably be dealing with are signed on to FATF regulations, but even their interpretation of FATF, or the Financial Action Task Force, will be slightly different based on their environment. You're going to see, obviously, that Canada's money laundering policies are significantly different from that of China's. So we'll see that. So one of the things that China has a big problem with is called capital flight. And that's because a lot of Chinese will want to bring their capital out of the country. Now, the difficulty with that is that China only limits you to $50,000 per year that one individual can bring out. Now, I haven't checked that in a couple of years, so the amount may have increased, but back in 2019, 2018, that was the limit. So what people would do is they would bring a lot of people that weren't traveling, that maybe didn't have a need to bring their money out, and they would essentially sell them their rights, obviously under the table, to use their capacity to move large amounts of money out of the country. So when it came to money laundering, if you were moving a large amount of money out of the country and you were Chinese, there was an additional hurdle that you had to deal with, whether or not that was illicit funds or illicit funds. You would have to essentially fit yourself into that 50,000. And so dealing with that, we see a lot of Chinese nationals will bring that sort of funding, they'll bring it to North America, and they'll invest it in the housing and real estate market. And because the vast majority of that isn't illicit funds, they're clean, good money, the Canadian government is quite happy to let foreign direct investment happen in Canada. Now, there are mixed views on whether or not that is good or bad. From a GDP, that's great, because foreign direct investment increases our GDP, and a high GDP is generally a identifier of a good cost, cost of living, a good lifestyle. But for many people that are looking to purchase homes, it drives people out of the housing market. So that's neither here nor there, but trade-based money laundering is a very critical issue that we need to look at from a security standpoint for the nation. Now, why am I talking about trade-based money laundering? Because the issues and the red flags that you see with trade-based money laundering are the same as overbilling. You're just substituting out the different entities. So, or you're moving the entities across borders. So you might have someone who's buying teddy bears, and they may say that, oh, this is the best teddy bear. It's like $600. It might be like something that you get from the dollar store, or it might be something that someone sewed in their backyard and it might have an eye falling out. But, someone is saying that this is worth $6 million. This cargo capacity is worth $6 million. And so you overbill that. That difference is then not taken in by the actual entity that is going to use it. The final destination of the money, it might bounce around using different other money laundering techniques before it gets to its final destination. But trade-based money laundering and a lot of money laundering share similar red flags and similar typologies to asset misappropriation and essentially fraud in general, because you'll see that the fraud typologies end up bleeding into them, because oftentimes fraud, which is a predicate offense, to money laundering will end up utilizing the same sort of resources, platforms, and chains and pathways to move their cash illicitly. Both of them share the same sort of methodology. You have something that you don't want seen, you need to cover it up, and you need to move it somewhere. And so understanding fraud will get you very close to being able to identify money laundering because the methodology is the same or very similar. So I'm going to stop here for a second so that we can sort of do an activity. I'm going to turn on my camera again. Oh, okay. I am sorry. Someone has their hand up. Thomas?
So, speaking about shell company,
Yes.
is shell company a legal company technically?
In this scenario, no. There's many. There are many definitions depending on which situation you're talking about. But in our definition, in this exact moment, it is a fictitious company that doesn't actually exist.
Oh.
Now, you may find such scenarios where an individual may incorporate a company just to make it seem more realistic, but the company doesn't actually do any work.
I have a question actually about
Yes.
that too. What if it is, well, would it be considered a shell company? Like a company that does something, does an activity, but declares a different activity? Like, let's say what they're doing is illegal, but they're declaring something illegal.
I think
Then that would be called a front.
I mean, a shell company can
Yeah.
also be a front as well, but
Yeah.
I think the key thing that we have to remember is that they are not doing what they say they're doing. And I think at the end of the day, the actions that they're doing are fictitious. They may be doing something else, like they may be, you may have a company that makes cupcakes, but
Right.
they
Like a bakery.
like a bakery,
That's good.
but they're not actually, doing.
They're not actually
good.
baking. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. So that would fall under shell companies as well.
Yes, it would.
Right?
Yes, it would.
Okay. Thank you.
So I'm actually going to skip to the end just because I put the slide at the end. That's all. We'll be back to this, but we're going to do this really fun activity. Well, I think it's fun. I don't know. You guys, up to you to see whether or not you think it's fun. Okay. So discovering red flags is critical to pinpointing a fraud typology. Now, the thing about that is, as investigators, when we're trained, we tend to focus on just like, okay, what are the typologies? There's 79. I got to learn all the red flags and stuff like that. But the thing about that is investigations are never textbook. And generally the ones that are never really fun anyways. But once you may get a whole pile of red flags, you'll need to identify a typology that they fit into. Now, I'd said before that when you have all these red flags, they may not always relate to one typology. You may have many typologies that overlap in order to support each other in concealing activities, concealing sources of funds. And so one of the things that investigators aren't trained as much for is creativity. So we're going to do an exercise to try to help flex creative muscles. And I think it's kind of fun. And also it's really good when you're trying to fit a whole bunch of things together to make sense of something when it doesn't make sense at all. And so, okay, so this is the exercise. I'm going to give you a normal everyday item, and we're going to try to come up with as many ways to use it as possible. You guys have 1 minute. So I'll say so the example here is a tin can. What can you do with a tin can? So there are some constraints. You can make minor alterations to the object to increase its use, but you cannot fundamentally change its structure. So the example would be, if you have a tin can, you can poke a hole in the back and connect a piece of string, and you can make a little telephone, and that's fine. But you can't melt it down and make a pair of scissors. You can't melt down the metal, pour it into a mold, make a pair of scissors. You can't do that. You can put a candle into it, so you can add things to it, but the majority of the use has to come from the object itself. So you can put a candle into the can to make a lantern, but you can't stick the can onto a ship. Like you can't flatten it out and put it onto a ship and be like, oh, look, it's part of the ship now. You've got to maintain to the best of your ability the structural integrity of whatever object it is. And so it's here to see how creative you guys can be to try to find every use you can, no matter how weird you can be, to use this object. Are there any questions? Okay, I'm not hearing any answers, so I'm assuming that there's no questions. Okay.
Maybe until we start the activity.
Okay.
Then we'll be thinking about it.
Okay, so I'm gonna want you guys to write down all of your, okay, I'll give you 2 minutes to make it easier. Write down all of your uses of it, and then we'll compare and we'll start to see how people's brains start to work and stuff. Okay, so the object that you're gonna use is you're gonna use a comb. So it is like a man's comb. It's standard with like the teeth. Ready? Go.
Oh, I thought we were supposed to think of the can. I was writing down the usage of the can.
No, the can was just an example.
Sorry, are we writing this in the chat or?
Oh, sorry.
No, you
what
can.
was the example?
Okay, well, we'll start this again then. You guys can just write it on a piece of paper and then or like on a notepad in the notepad app or something like that. And then you can just post your list of items.
Okay.
So clear, we're talking about a comb, not a tin can.
No. The tin can was an example.
So we're using a comb.
Well, I mean, we're not using a comb anymore because it's supposed to be like, here's an item, go for it. So there's no planning. Also, Zach, this is just an exercise to practice our creativity so that we're able to see things in many different perspectives.
So you can kind of ignore that. I kind of went lost when you brought this exercise. So.
Oh, okay. No worries. Okay, so the item we're going to be using is a bucket, a metal bucket. Okay, ready? And 2 minutes starts now. All right, guys, that's 2 minutes. Everyone stop. All right. If you can copy your list into the chat, we'll just quickly take a look at that. Okay. Okay. Okay, not bad, not bad. Flower pot. Okay, a lot of people got barbecue. That was kind of cool. Huh. Okay. Okay, there we go. That's what I'm talking about. Yes, Claudia, going for the violence. Okay, okay. So generally everyone's kind of posted now. So that's really, really good. But we can sort of see there is a significant difference in a lot of the ways that people would use it. Like Andrew said mousetrap, which I thought was really, really cool, because that's one of the things that you don't really think about. You know, like, you know, put the little stick there, you've got the, you know, the string and the cheese, and you kind of like yank it out and you capture the mouse. Most people said something along the lines of seat or bin for stuff. But Camilla said pot. I mean, she didn't really say pot, but she said boil egg and potato to, you know, make a sandcastle and stuff like that. And then you could put sand in it and use it to work out. So this is kind of what they're like. So first off, there's like no wrong answer to this, but it's just, it's important because you can see that everyone is looking at this very, very differently. So being able to look at this in many different ways is going to allow you to be able to hopefully look at a set of red flags and be like, okay, well, we kind of, I think this is, okay, it's kind of weird, but I think we can sort of do it this way. So one of the things that, so I say this because a couple of years ago, I was working on a case where this, and I was working on a case where there was this family and people would just, you know, pay into this family, pay money, and then it'd be weird because then like the mother would get this and then she'd loan the money to the son who would then loan it to the daughter who would then loan it back to the dad who would then like put it in a trust account or something like that. And there was a lot of different like ways to look at it. And people were like, oh yeah, they're, you know, a lot of people were like, oh, it's just weird family stuff. They're just moving cash around. But then Intel had come in that said that, you know, they were in fact, you know, involved in things that were not so great.
And that's a way to like, what do we call that? Like to distribute illicit money, but to make it legal. Like you distribute money among family members so that placement, they call it. I think, isn't that part of placement?
That's called
where you
placement.
take the cash.
That's called structuring, actually.
And that's right. Oh, structuring, either or. And then you try to rotate it so that
exactly.
it looks good.
So
Yes.
one of the cool things about that is it's a very specific way of structuring, because if you ended up looking at it, none of the funds ended up crossing over this almost imaginary line that we had in the middle of the family. So I'm gonna draw this out because it's fun to draw. But the cool thing about this family was there was almost a division amongst them. And, you know, they were a very loving family, so nothing to do with like, you know, who ate the last piece of cake, but it's almost this division here. And they would get money would come in from here. and it would go here, 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 and then it would go back to this dad, and then this dad would send it to a trust account. I apologize for the handwriting, it's pretty horrible.
No.
And then you have funds that would go here, 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 and they would just bounce all the way around all over again, and they would come here. But the issue was we couldn't find a connection between persons here and persons here. So this is a very specific type of money laundering, and let's see if anyone knows what it is.
Yeah, that's it. I agree, Camilla. I think that's exactly what they were doing.
Is it smurfing?
Close, but no significant.
Because technically the members of the family are acting as smurfs in this case.
Yes, you could say that. You could say that, but okay. So I'll give you a little bit more information. Intel said that they were in on it, that they were not just passersby that were like, oh, hey, here's $50, like, you know, do this for us.
So they were getting something.
They were not laundering other people's money, but also their money.
They were laundering their money, which makes them not Smurfs.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
They're part of the operation, I guess.
But
not just
I mean, it's their
temporary.
money.
They're actually, it's their own money.
Yeah.
Making layers, no?
No, well, okay, so you guys are all kind of right. This type of money laundering is called a hawala. And a hawala has been used for thousands and thousands of years.
I'm not, sorry for interrupting, but hawala is a remittance system. They're not remitting money here.
But the thing is, they're using familial relationships to pass money through without actually moving money around.
But like you don't have like hawala is it's pretty much like I know people, I know in the West it's seen as a avenue of money laundering, but in underrepresented and underdeveloped countries where banking systems are not developed, it's practically a way of remitting. So
you were very correct. I wasn't trying to say that.
No, but I don't see because in the hawala scheme, there are three parties, right? There's the depositor, there's the hawaladar who takes the money and remits it to his colleague in the other location that the money needs to be sent, and his colleague deposits it with the receiver.
True. I'm trying to say that they're
here.
Okay, so that totally makes sense. So this is how the case was identified. So we had a set of drug dealers, and the drug dealers had a set of cash that they wanted to get to this individual. There was a flight that someone had strapped on a couple of bricks of cocaine, and they needed to get that sort of stuff out of the country. So they had done that. Now they needed to pass the money back, but they didn't want to have a direct link to the money moving back towards the drug dealers. So what did they do? They had a family, and the family, they paid one member of the family, and that member just held onto the cash. The other individual, the other family member in another country, took his savings, clean money, and passed it back to the drug dealer. They knew that because of their familial tie, they could trust each other, and eventually along the lines, maybe time delay, 6 months to a year, 8 months, 14 months, it doesn't really matter, but on a significant amount of time that would pass, so that there was less of a direct connection, they would then sort of settle their accounts between each other. Be like, oh, hey, I know you're my brother, I know you're my sister, you're my cousin, like I trust you that you will eventually give me my money. And so that amount was then exchanged at a later date, and the drug dealer was able to get their money for delivering the product. And so again, not saying all hawalas are like that, but just like we could say that about banking systems in general. Like banking systems are not innately bad or have nefarious purposes, depending on who you ask, I guess, but they can be utilized for people to move illicit things. Same with like the post office. The post office, you can move illicit, materials through the post office. Now, does that mean the post office is bad? No, the post office is the post office. So yes, sorry, that was my spiel there. Yes. But yeah, so the purpose of that exercise was to identify, let's see, make can see the sources we're using this and transfer just like yeah. So they were using the Hawala system to transfer the funds pretty much in the same way that you'd use it's just another form of banking. So not to say that Hawalas are used to transfer illicit funds. It could. And because the case was being investigated by Western investigators that were not familiar with this concept of money movement, they were just like, oh man, like I don't know how this is being done. Like, how are they moved? That I see no money pass between them. And so that confused them a lot and allowed the perpetrators to go unarrested or undealt with for quite a while because of the obscuring of the path of money. Yeah, of course. Just like the post office or just like the bank. So when they looked back at, they took a further step back. So generally, it was a compliance investigation. And the compliance investigation ended up only having a time frame of about like 6 months. So because of that, they weren't able to see the full picture. So once they went back and they opened up the investigation to a 5-year time span, and they were able to see that the amounts generally were the same, or they were like similar enough. They'd see movements here. They'd see the 2 movements come in, and then they'd wait and they'd see one large one that amounted to the same transaction appear 6 months to 4 months to 6 months later. And so they started seeing this trend, and they were able to be like, oh, hey, it looks like that was the trend. And they started identifying who was moving the money, and they were able to identify the culprits that were involved in this. And so because of that, they were able to pass that information on to the police, and I believe that they were dealt with, or they were arrested for that.
But how did you establish connection between the source and the recipient? The last end recipient, like the one on the other end.
Oh, yes. So we were able to identify that because now I was involved in the compliance investigation, not the law enforcement investigation. So the difference, and this is one of the things that we will eventually talk about as well, but the difference between a compliance investigation and a law enforcement investigation is the law enforcement will actually go all the way through, versus a compliance investigation says, oh, hey, there are multiple red flags. There is suspicious transactions. Let's file a report. And that becomes a part of a mosaic of information and intel that is then pulled from by law enforcement to conduct their investigations. So I believe the law enforcement, they did a controlled delivery of narcotics from the individual, and then once they were able to arrest that individual, they were able to get him to talk about the system. So they were able to identify with a witness testimony that this money that was moved here was actually a part of this drug movement. So, because if we don't, essentially it's all hearsay. It's like, yeah, that looks weird, but we can't substantiate it. So the only way we were able to identify it, or they were able to identify it, was they had a witness testimony to say, hey, yes, this is actually drug money.
Okay, yeah, that was actually my question. Because compliance, it's only to see whether it was done legally and following proper procedure, isn't it? investigation
Yes.
and most the criminal part of it was that something illicit done, right?
So compliance, will see two distinct divisions of compliance. One compliance is like, oh, hey, policy and regulatory.
Yeah.
Are you doing that? But then also you have the component of compliance where your regulatory ends up being legal, like laws and legislation.
Yeah.
So like banking compliance is like pretty much financial crime investigation, except you don't go completely to the end. You don't get the warrants, you don't do the busts. But
yeah, you don't escort people to the jail.
To the cruisers.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. No worries, no worries. So yeah, let's let's continue. So I'm not expecting you guys to read through all this, and we're not going to go through this. This is red flag risk indicators for trade-based money laundering and asset misappropriation. This is just here for you guys to refer to in the future if, you know, you're investigating a case or you are operating in a cash-heavy environment or something like that, and then you see things like this happen, and hopefully it'll be like, oh wait, I think I had a class on that, and there's a list of red flags that I can look at and see whether or not that applies. So yes, do not worry if you saw this slide and you're like, that's so much stuff and so much writing. We're not going through it. It's just here for reference. Same with this one. So financial statement schemes. And this is where I think the textbook and the course really wants us to kind of stay, because of the fact that financial statement fraud is, while it's not very frequent, it ends up being very, very damaging for both the company, for both the nation versus state versus foreign direct investment. So you'll see that every country has a corruption index. It has a rating on whether or not it is safe or good to invest in. And so you'll see countries like Vietnam not have a very good rating because they don't follow the rule of law. They don't have property rights. They have nationalization of foreign assets. So when people invest, they're like, okay, well, we can invest in Sweden or you can invest in Vietnam. And then they'll be like, oh, well, Sweden has a rule of law and they're more likely to, you know, uphold any sort of legal lawsuits. They have a judiciary that is independent. Well, let's invest there. Now, obviously, there's more components to that. There's, you know, like, oh, there's growth, there's risk and stuff like that. But from a strictly safety of assets component and perspective, you're more likely to deal with Sweden than Vietnam for that exact reason. But financial statement schemes generally follow similar sort of red flags, and you'll see accounting anomalies, or what people like to call very flexible accounting. You'll have rapid growth, unusual profits, internal control weaknesses, aggressive execution of management. So you'll see management they'll make very, very quick, very vague rulings on certain things. So like, oh, we don't do this now. From now on, this is forbidden. And you'll see a lot of that opaqueness in management style in companies that have a lot to hide. And there's a division you'll see between the blue collar worker and the management for that exact reason, because you have to almost join that sort of group to be let into, oh yeah, this is what we're doing. You know, like, are you one of us? You in or you out sort of thing. You'll see that there is a significant obsession.
Isn't that, I'm sorry, but isn't that the case in every single corporation when you have management that don't like to be questioned? I mean, right?
I mean, it's true.
It doesn't have to be financial. I mean, management don't like usually to explain their decision once it's made, unless you're part of management or an equal, then they can. But I mean, if you know what I mean, I think to me that's not, like, this is not, to me, that would be a red flag, because just how management acts in general for whatever reason.
Well, then again, if you look at this, right, like red flags on their own don't mean anything. They're just, that's weird. Or maybe for you, oh, that's normal. But once you start to see, you know, accounting anomalies, and then maybe you talk to the management like, hey, like, you know, I'm an accountant, and, or, you know, I'm doing some clerkships or billings, and I saw this and it was kind of weird. And then you're just like, oh, and they're like, you know, this is not your job. You know, you don't worry about this. I'll just take this for you. Sorry, Dale, you had your hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I don't want to deviate from what you're saying, but I was just listening, obviously, and going through the notes. And earlier you had mentioned about the difference between like the various accounting professionals or the different professionals that can identify fraud. And at this point, when you're talking about the financial statement schemes, would an internal auditor, I know they're not the same, but would an internal auditor not be able to identify some of these concerns? Obviously, it depends on the type of business, but wouldn't an internal auditor be able to at least identify some of these issues?
So that, first off, that's a really good question, because yes, you would think that they would be able to see that, but oftentimes the issue with financial auditors is they work off of a sampling system. So they will identify sampling based on, you know, like, okay, well, this is, you know, a random sampling of transactions that we do. Now, whether or not the fraud occurs in that sample, we're not sure. They, you know, fraudsters will switch up their cadence. So you'll have, you know, like fraud, no fraud, fraud, no fraud. And so you'll see that there is an issue that they may not see it. Now, whether or not, if they do see it, then yeah, obviously you'll see accounting anomalies, they'll pick it up and that'll become the start of an investigation. But a lot of times they only look at what is exactly in front of them. And not what could be. So if, say, you'll have accounting anomalies where it's like, oh, we're just going to buy specifically from this one business. Why are we buying from this business when it's really expensive? Now, that doesn't really mean anything to a financial auditor, because they're like, okay, well, there was an invoice. This invoice was paid correctly. We were following GAAP. We, you know, put this expense in this journal entry. We allocated it to the right month. You know, we got the service and we paid for the service. You know, we realize the cost in the right way. GAAP is satisfied. For them, you know, that's kind of the end of it. But for us, it's like, okay, well, this cost, this expense, it's exorbitant. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you do this? We see that in 6 months ago, you switched to another, or sorry, yes, 6 months from this one entity, this one entry, you switched to another. There's another cost that comes up that shows a similar business that's significantly less costly. Why didn't you go with that business when this business is so expensive? And maybe you have the fraudster sending, you know, to that one, that company that they own, a fictitious company. And then maybe they were on vacation, maybe they were sick or something, and someone took over the billing and they're just like, oh, hey, we also just, I don't know, I didn't know which company we're using, so I just Googled the company and paid it. And so from an accounting perspective, that might be like, okay, cool, you know, maybe there was an issue. That's why we're using this one. And so they see two bills, two invoices, two different amounts. And they might be like, okay, that's expensive and that's less expensive, but they both make sense. And so they're like, okay, cool, that's end of my job. Versus us who might be like, okay, this is weird. We see additional other red flags. You know, this is now adding on to those red flags. What's going on here?
Okay, so maybe I should reframe my question. Would a financial auditor be different from an internal auditor, or are they one and the same?
They're generally one and the same.
They're generally, okay. I had the impression that an internal auditor would have a little bit more independence, but maybe their scope is still quite limited.
So I'm just going to add a caveat just because
sure.
wasn't exactly correct.
Every company is different, right?
Yeah. Because, okay, you'll have a financial auditor, but you'll also have an external versus an internal auditor, right?
Right.
So I don't know, if you call KPMG and you're like, hey, can you audit my firm just to make sure everything's good? Like that we're all following GAAP, you know, they'll come in and they'll do it. But you may have someone from the accounting department that's like, oh, hey, I'm just constantly running the internal audits. And then maybe once every 3 years, a KPMG analyst comes in and just checks him like, oh yeah, okay, you did this right. Okay, cool.
I don't know how I feel about having internal auditors. I feel like you're giving them
Way too much
extra
power.
power. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that's how fraud would happen too. Like, I'm not going to give one person or one department the entire power to do auditing between themselves, because then you don't know what's really happening. Auditing for me is auditing. Somebody external audits, not somebody from the department's doing it. That's coaching, not auditing, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
my opinion.
No, that's. I mean, I share that opinion as well, just because sometimes you go into a firm, and granted, this was as a forensic auditor, but like you go into a firm and you're just looking at things, and like they turn out to be legitimate costs and stuff, but you're just like, why are you doing it like this? This makes no sense. This is, and you're like, okay, well, let's dig into this. You end up digging into it till the very end, and you're like, okay, there was nothing illicit, there was nothing illegal about this. It's just weird and inefficient, and I don't get why you're doing it, but they still do it. So,
well, thanks for that. I really appreciate it. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it Enron or one of these companies, their internal auditors actually never caught the fraud, even though there were flags that were auditing, but like you rightly said, I guess they just looked at the documentation. It looked right from their standards and their standpoint, but it still wasn't adequate enough of control to have internal auditors looking at the accounting anomalies or anything. They just looked at the statements, said what they said, and moved forward.
Yeah, I agree. Plus, I'll just share my own experience. Like, I worked for nonprofit. That was before or prior to my knowledge, or me working in a financial institution, and I was doing the fund management for the project. So if I were to sit here in Montreal, well, back then it was Montreal, and check the record of what I was sent of where the money was actually going, everything looked fine, because you were provided with receipt and you were provided with numbers as to what material costs, right? But then I went on the ground, and on the ground, yes, I'm getting receipt, but there was no material, zero. So if I wasn't on the ground and I was to rely on the paperwork or the reports I was getting, everything looked perfectly fine. But then once on the ground, I had receipt, but I had no material. I'm like, where is what was supposed to be bought with the money for the past year? And there was none. The material was different too, like the stuff or the little things that was available. On the receipt, it's something at a higher cost. On the ground, it's a complete different material. So I don't trust auditing that way, and I just think it needs to be external. That's just me.
So that's so you've dealt with this like in the real world, like not an
I was shocked. I'm like, but this is the receipt. So where is the thing? And there was no material on the ground. So to me, then I don't trust anything unless it's done externally.
So it's good that you guys brought up Enron. Well, we're gonna eventually talk about Enron, but prior to Enron, there was no requirement for a yearly or bi-yearly or tri-yearly external audit to come in. Because of Enron and WorldLink and stuff like that, you ended up having Sarbanes-Oxley or the SOX Act, and that required certain reporting policies, reporting procedures, and the use of external auditors to then audit the auditors. There you go.
Thank you.
Claudia, that was perfectly timed. Good job. That's right. I'll get back to this. So you're going to see financial statement schemes in which one of the red flags are a obsession with stock prices by executive management. Now, like we said before, that may just be management, because management is pretty obsessed with that. And there is a significant correlation between bonuses and stock price and market share. So you might just be worried about that normally, but in conjunction with everything else, it may be a red flag. Then you're going to see financial statement schemes come about after a threat to financial stability or to a profitability by economic, industrial, or internal operational conditions. Remember that the fraudsters generally are benefiting when the company is doing well. there is a significant correlation between how the company is doing and how they are doing financially or monetarily. And so you're going to see them be very, very quick to deal with issues of financial stability. They may want to make sure that the company looks like it's doing better than it is. New legislation might come out, like, legislation about carbon emissions, or what chemicals they can use, and that may hamper profitability, which then will cause them to be like, okay, well, if we can't portray the company in a certain light, how are we going to be able to do the things that we do? How are we going to be able to enjoy the certain life that we enjoy? And then that adds more pressure, that adds more motivation. They may even rationalize it by saying, hey, if the company goes down, or like the stock prices go down, we may lose workers. We may have to let people go. And that may be the rationalization to commit the fraud. I'm going to actually turn off my video just because I can sort of see myself lagging, and I hope that my voice isn't lagging. Okay, that's good.
I think in times where the companies are doing well, they tend to be less worried about the financial aspect of things, especially if they're doing really well. So maybe that's where, because there is less auditing, I would say, or less monitoring of the financial records if the company is doing well.
I mean, also you have to look at the fact that if the company is doing well, are they doing well because they're doing well, or are they doing well because they're committing fraud?
I don't know. To me, if they're doing well, they're doing well. I guess I'm wrong.
No. I mean, it's a right assertion. It's just, I think you need to. We all just need to just double check. Trust but verify, because sometimes you see something and things aren't always what they seem. And I think, yeah, that just makes me a little bit cynical, but I'm okay with that. So, of these red flags, most common red flag of the category is a management style or the character change of someone in a position of power. We usually see senior managers are generally harder to observe weaknesses in personal ethics, but they also exhibit an overly aggressive nature. So you'll see a significantly distinct change in normal habits and behavior, and oftentimes that becomes the calling card that'll essentially leads you to look at more red flags. And I know this is under financial statement schemes, but like I said at the very beginning, behavioral changes are indicative of many different types of fraud. Speaking of which, what are the schemes that we're talking about when we're talking about financial statement schemes? Well, we can talk about timing differences. And so while this is a fraud, this may also be an inability to follow GAAP procedures. So timing differences talks about a way that you commit fraud by spacing out or offsetting certain expenses or revenues. So with channel stuffing, you'll push excessive inventory to salespeople or consignments, and then you realize it as a sale before they've actually sold it. So then what happens there is, in the short run, you'll see that, oh man, we made so many sales in this quarter, and then maybe in the second quarter, you'll see a whole bunch of refunds, which will then reduce the revenue. So you'll see that maybe you'll have two companies that are merging, or some bad press has come out, and you'll see that the company stock price is tanking. So what do? Well, we're making so many sales, so everyone must still love us. And you can sometimes manually edit and manipulate stock prices in that way. So you might be like, oh, hey, let's cushion the falling stock. Let's cushion the falling stock by, reporting sales that don't exist. And then we will, report the sales, the returns next quarter when, sales generally are high. Like if you have Christmas, maybe you sell a lot, or if you're Hallmark, you sell a lot of cards during Mother's Day. So maybe you'll say, hey, we've sold a whole bunch of cards during this era where we need to have sales to, make people feel good and get people to feel confident about our company. And then we'll kind of push the refunds into a period of time where we do naturally make a lot of sales. And then, that will cushion the loss of revenue as well. you'll see early revenue recognition. And it's very similar where you'll be like, hey, we got a contract for a company, and then we've got this contract, and then we just code it as if the contract is already done. And so we look like we've just doubled or tripled the amount of cash flow that we have, but we actually haven't. And we actually saw this, if you guys are familiar with Nortel, Northern Telecom, back in the 90s. They were a very large employer for a lot of Ontario. And what they did was they would solicit contracts from companies. Like, they were genuinely a very good company, but they would solicit these contracts from these companies and then code them as payment received. And so from like a balance sheet perspective, it just looked like accounts receivable to cash, accounts receivable to cash. And so everyone was like, wow, like not only are they, getting contracts left, right, and center, but they're also like, they're killing it on like, processing and, like conducting themselves. And the issue happened when, as you end up happening, the greed got the better of them, and they started to do that even in times where there wasn't really a significant need for it. They ended up realizing revenues that weren't really there, and it ended up catching up with them. And they sprung a leak that they couldn't fix, and it all came out. So timing differences can be an interesting, also a very effective way of changing the representation of a company to make it seem better or worse. It's generally very, very effective for dealing with stock prices as well. Then we've got fictitious revenues. So you could say that, oh, I sold this contract, oh, but it's in accounts receivable. And then you offset it to bad debts. So one of the accounts that you have, it's called a contra account in accounting. And don't worry about it, guys. You don't really need to know about this too much, just more conceptually, is a contra account that says bad accounts. And it's essentially, cell phone companies will use it when, someone doesn't pay their bill and it passes like 90% due, and they just write it off. So they essentially shift that loss of revenue to an account that's made just to balance the sheets. Generally, those accounts can be used to manipulate certain sales. So you may say, hey, you know what? I have an accounts receivable, which means someone said that they would pay me. And then, they would pay us for a service. And then so from a balance sheet perspective, we see a significantly more assets than we have liabilities. And then we end up seeing that there is an increase in the bottom line. But that's fictitious. You never actually sold anything. So you end up, moving that to bad debts, which is a contra account that essentially balances itself off in the next quarter, maybe the quarter where you don't have to talk to, say, shareholders, or you don't have that big, I don't know, like Apple convention where you show off new products or something like that. So there's always ways for you to utilize financial statements and manipulate them to showcase a different perspective of a company. And then, you got standard schemes, you got your concealed liabilities. So that means that liabilities that you're not realizing yet. So I have to pay hydro. And then I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna delay that. And I just don't pay it for like 3 months. Like 4 months is when they shut off the electricity, but I don't pay it. So it looks like, oh, hey, I have a lot of money in my bank account because I just haven't paid for my hydro bill yet. Then you've got improper disclosures and improper asset valuation, where you might have something that you value differently. So like, okay, a very good example of this is when you're looking at mining companies. A mining company will look at a certain deposit that they have discovered in the ground, and using specific geological techniques, they will estimate what the value of the gold, value of the diamonds, or the oil, or whatever natural resource exists in the ground. So the thing about that is that valuation technique is not always standardized. You may, just like in accounting, you may use, first in, first out, last in, last out. You may use different ways to estimate that. And because of that, you may overestimate or purposely overestimate the value of that deposit. you won't know until you dig it up. But for now, it's something that you can end up using to negotiate, loans or stock prices or essentially anything, really. By inflating the amounts of an asset, capitalizing expenses, or deflating contra accounts, the financials will show a higher than truthful equity and profit rate. And essentially, that's what we're really, really looking at. So then we're looking at corruption schemes. Corruption schemes are characterized by someone on the inside, either an employee or of a victim company, and they're working with someone who is not part of that, someone on the outside. You can reduce the size of the groups as well and say that, hey, this is, management and blue collar, and someone from blue collar is, wanting to do something, and someone in management is corrupt and letting them do that for a kickback or something like that. And in that way, you don't actually have an in company and an outside company. You just have an in group and an out group. And both of them are working together to, for some end. And the thing about the difference between corruption is that there's always someone that is doing and someone that is either allowing it to be done or someone who is being forced to do it. Sorry, I saw a question. Yes, I actually skipped that on purpose because we talked about that already, and I know the slides pretty well. Yeah.
So both sides have to be willing for corruption to work.
Not exactly, because you can use extortion, and that's also a type of corruption. So if, I don't know, someone finds out that I am a 32-year-old that still plays Pokemon, I don't know, I'm pretty proud of it. So I'm like level 42, but someone might not be. And they're like, okay, you know what? If you don't do what I say, I want to tell the world that you still play Pokemon at 32 years old. Extortion is a form of corruption. And except the benefit that you are getting from someone doesn't always have to be monetary. It can be, it can be reputational. It could be branding, blackmail.
Then you just have to post a Pokemon picture and sort of like take the power yourself. That's what I would do. I'll just post it myself, and that's it.
I mean,
I'll tell everybody myself. There's nothing wrong with that.
I mean, there's also there's different things. You might have. You'll see this happen with politicians a lot. They get indicted for a small offense, or they get commit some sort of fraud themselves, and then someone says, "Hey, you know what? Like, I know that you committed that fraud. If this got out, then you'd lose office. A lot of things bad would happen to you." And so they end up weighing what they would lose versus what they would keep, and they're like, okay, I can let you do this thing, I can let you get this contract, I can turn my head and turn a blind eye or something like that. Yes, Sarah, don't worry, the lecture is recorded, so you're good.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yes, Tom Ford and the video. But yeah, so corruption always involves two parties, but one of them can be non-compliant. One of them is the actor. One of them is non-compliant. That can be a thing as well. So we're looking for red flags, and in corruption, you're looking at relationships between key employees and authorized vendors. How about secrecy around third-party relationships? You're like, oh, how do you know that person? Oh yeah, I don't know. Don't worry about it. A lack of review on management for approvals or for known third-party relationships that exist. You may see that a fraudster may begin to steal using a relationship if the entity gets comfortable with it. You may see two individuals working together, and then you'll see corruption start to merge with asset misappropriation. So like we said before, frauds are never distinct. They can bleed into each other, they can merge, they can do a lot of things. You'll see a lot of anomalies in recording transactions. You'll see shifts in benefits. So you'll see, oh, hey, like this person is getting this. Oh, why is he getting a bonus? Why is he getting the stock that's meant for someone else. Why is he getting the raise? Why is he getting the promotion? A lot of these frauds are not specific to the monetary capacity. A lot of them are actually based around just benefit. So you'll see a lot of like tit for tat. You'll see that there is a corruption in the, I forget, it happened recently. What's her name? She was one of the aunts in Full House. Her son got into the university because they bribed a
Oh,
coach.
Varsity Blue scandal.
Yes, that's the one. See,
Yep.
that is a very good idea of corruption. Now, the thing is, for many of them, one of them, the fraud, the compensation that the coach got wasn't actually money. One of his beginning students, the benefit he got was he got introduced to this in crowd where he started to make more money from there. So as you can see, there's not exactly a monetary benefit that has to happen. It just tends to be monetary just because it generally is easier. So with conflicts of interest aren't always corrupt, though they are often lumped in there if there is an interest that you have and you have a modicum of responsibility or power in that situation. You may showcase that you are not, you cannot be unbiased because you do have a vested interest. Now, is that corruption? Not if you declare it, and in many circumstances, yeah, it sucks. I'm just gonna, not abstain myself, and then you're fine. But it is one of the most frequent aspects of corruption. You are going to see a lot of bribery that exists in many sort of industries. Various industries will be more. You'll see more evidence of bribery and corruption than others, and in many different environments, you'll see more than others. In conflict of interest, the difference between a conflict of interest and other corruptions and fraud is the fact that fraudsters exert their influence, because the personal interest is in existence doesn't exactly mean that a fraud has occurred. It is more of a red flag. It kind of fits in this zone between red flag and actual corruption. Now, if you address the conflict of interest, then it's fine. But if you can have the perception of corruption without actually any corruption occurring. You can have a conflict of interest, but you could adjudicate such a decision completely fairly and still have the perception of corruption. Now, does that mean corruption has occurred? No, not exactly. Will people treat it as if corruption has occurred? Probably. We in Canada have history with corruption as well. SNC-Lavalin was charged with using bribes to solicit contracts in the countries that they operate in, specifically in South America and in Southeast Asia. Additionally, we have issues where bribery can be defined as offering, giving, receiving, or soliciting anything of value to influence an official act or business decision. Now, this kind of brings us to our next sort of kind of discussion piece, is that there are countries in which bribery is a normal occurrence. Sometimes they don't even look at it. But I remember back when I was working, I started at the bank as a bank teller, and we had very recently there's an influx of Cuban immigrants into Ottawa, and they would go to the bank, and then after they were done transacting at the teller wicket, they would some of them would try to slip cash to the tellers. And it was definitely a different thing because it was not a part of the culture that we are used to. So I guess my question to you guys is, from a corruption index, from a thinking about fraud and stuff, what are your feelings for dealing with this? I'm trying to word this very carefully. Dealing with this when you are in an environment where fraud is considered, bribery is considered the norm. So like if you go to Cuba, or if you go to Honduras, or if you go to Vietnam, or if you go to Australia, like, sorry, I'm seeing participants raise their hand. Yes. Yeah.
Ennis, name is Ennis.
Ennis, sorry.
I use my initials. I'll definitely change my name for the next class. I think another good measure to look at would be corruption perception index, which measures the perceived amount, like the perception on corruption in a country.
Yes.
So I would be, it doesn't matter what I think about the corruption in Cuba or in Turkey or in Russia. I would be more interested to hear how Russians or Cubans or Turks think how corrupt their country are. Then I would have a better idea. But for the sake of the argument, I just I wouldn't tend to go with the cliches, because I think in the West, especially in North America, people tend to think certain parts of the world are like outright corrupt, and that's it. So I think I would be more careful before I start making assumptions, because it would be surprising the initiatives taken in third world, in certain countries to deal with corruption. For example, in Georgia, the previous president eradicated police corruption in only 5 years. Like it was so rampant, and it was brought up down to, it was from 99%, it was brought down to almost non-existent.
So that's actually really interesting that you brought that up, because while it scores very low on the corruption perception index, America is one of the most corrupt countries planet. So a lot of, like, if you ask Americans, like, oh, is your country corrupt? They're like, no, they're not.
Yeah, they would say
but
no.
Per capita, we see that America, from a corruption standpoint, actually exceeds countries like Zimbabwe, Saudi Arabia, and stuff like that. So it's very interesting that you brought up this perception component. So
but in Zimbabwe or Saudi Arabia, people will agree that their country is corrupt. Maybe they will think that it's more corrupt than it is, unlike in the United States, but people will still accept that they live in a corrupt country.
Because
sorry, go ahead.
I think the reason for that is that people think that because you're technically in a democratic country, freedom country and what's not, then that means that you should technically don't have corruption. Well, you shouldn't be having any corruptions or any economical issues. And I think that's why countries that fall under in developed category or developed countries are the ones that sometimes take time to address socioeconomical issues, unlike other countries, like developing countries, only because it's easier to recognize that there is a lack either way. Plus, you have international organizations that will point out to you from time to time, regardless, that you do have corruption that you need to address, that you do have, but that wouldn't be the case for a developed country. It's just my opinion, but I also think it's very interesting that you brought it up. And yes, people do think that because you're in a developed country, well, you don't have issues of fraud and crime, which is not the case, because it has nothing to do with the country. It has to do with individuals.
Very true. There is a very distinct way and form in which every country will deal with corruption, for
And
better
sorry,
or for worse.
Calvin, sorry, but like when we're talking about corruption in this course, I assume it's practically talking about white collar crime or financial corruption, not academic or I don't know, governmental or.
No, what we're talking about bribes and kickbacks for contracts. And
Okay.
financial
All right.
crimes. We're not.
All right.
This is I guess we're talking
When
about
when you say corruption, it's a very, very vast notion.
yes, and we do not have enough time for that. But yes, you guys are definitely very, very right, and it's good that we brought up this because it's a good talking point as well, because I think when you identify that corruption exists, regardless of whether or not you think that there's a lot or you think that there's not very much, like when you bring it up, at least it's top of mind, you get to recognize, you see the red flags, but when the perception is that there is no corruption, that becomes the worst case for corruption. And we see that in companies that we investigate as well. So a couple of years back, I was doing an investigation of a company that was, I think just the branding was so great. It was like a sleep country style of company. They made mattresses, but what no one looked to investigate them because they just seemed so wholesome. But long story short, it turns out that they were smuggling things inside their mattresses that were being manufactured, and they were struggling around the country, throughout the the continent and stuff like that. And there was just, it's perception can kind of be your biggest hurdle sometimes. But yes. Yes, actually we talked about that. Our conversation.
I know some multinational companies, especially mining companies, write it off as cost of doing business when they're trying to prospect in third world, like in Africa or South America.
So yeah, because they kind of follow this rule of thumb that says, when in Rome, you do what the Romans do. But at the same time, the OECD talks about eradicating corporate crime across borders as well. And obviously, we're not going to get into that because we've always said that it is far too vast for the scope of this course. But it was more of just a talking point from that. But yeah, we kind of covered all that corruption stuff actually with our conversation. But I want to talk to you guys a little bit about predicate crimes and predicate offenses before we end off for today. Predicate offenses, as we talked about before, refer to a crime which is a component of a larger crime. So in a financial context, the predicate offense would be any crime that generates monetary proceeds. So any activity that would create proceeds that would need to be laundered. So dealing with predicate offenses, you'll end up seeing that, like we said before, predicate offenses will affect how the money and the funds are laundered. If you are dealing with a financial statement fraud, or you'll see that generally the monetary, so the methodology for dealing with that sort of funding will end up being very similar to the fraud that created it. We'll see that, for example, producing unlawful funds is a primary offense, and the money laundering would be the predicate offense. That's not correct. That is incorrect. Don't look at that. But yes, so this brings us to the detection model. Recognizing signs of fraud, red flags, is the first and also one of the most difficult because there are so many that exist out there. And their appearance can be very benign in nature, especially when you're considering it a single transaction. When we were doing transaction monitoring back in the day, there used to be a thing that said, like, if it happened once, like, oh, it's a one-off, and you'd like disregard it. But then the issue happens when you start to see multiple instances that are disguised and spread out, or varying amounts that make it very, very difficult to see. So identifying this and the detection model of being able to see a red flag, no matter how it's been permutated, which generally happens a lot, is a key aspect of dealing with financial crimes, and key aspect of being able to identify these schemes that are being utilized. And then, this is just a skills exercise that we went through, but